Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Well, today we're going to be in the fall of Babylon. There is much Old Testament imagery in chapters 17 and 18. We were told about the fall of Babylon back in chapter 14:8, and it was somewhat described in chapter 16:18 through 21. We're using imagery from the fall of some other ancient cities. Number one, and particularly, I think, the fall of Babylon. Throughout these two chapters, Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51 is going to be quoted over and over again. But along with Jeremiah, the fall of Babylon is described in Isaiah 13 and 14 and 21, and there's much allusion from that section also. Then from the fall of Tyre, which would be Isaiah 23 and Ezekiel 26 through 28, which really forms the major backdrop to chapter 17. And also to some extent the fall of Nineveh, Nahum chapter 3 verse 4. And it may be surprising, but Jerusalem is also called a prostitute in Ezekiel 16. That's the major imagery. It's not by accident that the only Old Testament passages that deal somewhat with Satan and his pride and fall are behind the imagery of the fall of Babylon in Isaiah 14 and the fall of the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 28. The great whore also has that same problem with pride. Now, there have been three enemies through here. There's been Satan, there's been the two beasts, and there's been this false world system that we've called the whore of Babylon. Now, I think the description is Old Testament. It can apply to any earthly city. In John's day, chapter 17 is obviously Rome. There's no way you can get around the imagery he uses. But I think the description of a fallen, rebellious society goes far beyond Rome, and we can go back to Daniel chapter 2 and see a series of world empires that get progressively anti-God. This is very similar to what we have in 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 29, about the world system. And John talks a lot about the world, human society, organized and functioning apart from God. So let's go to the text, chapter 17. Then one of the seven angels with the seven bowls came and spoke to me. Now this same imagery is used in chapter 21, verse 9, the same angel. Now, is this after the bowls were poured out or before? Well, I'm not sure, because I don't really believe that Revelation is in chronological order. It's kind of more in cyclical order, and we're developing themes in intensity. Now, notice where it says, "Come, and I will show you the doom of the noted prostitute." Now, the noted prostitute down in verse 5 is called Mighty Babylon, the mother of prostitutes. And I think we're pulling on the imagery from going back to Nimrod, who was one of the fallen line of Cain, who began the city of Babel, which is the first organized rebellion against God that came to be the kingdom of Babylon that stands for all human organization apart from God. Now, who was seated on many waters. Now that sounds just like Jeremiah 51:13. But in verse 15 is described as many peoples. So here we have an allusion back to the city of Babylon, but it's reinterpreted to stand for empire or kingdoms, which would fit Rome. In whose prostitution the kings of the earth have joined. Now this seems to refer basically to their idolatry, participating in commerce we're going to find in chapter 18. And this commerce had to do with political alliances. We see it in the city of Tyre, Isaiah 23, verses 13 through 18, and the city of Nineveh, Nahum 3:4. So it's caught up in commerce. The lure of this great prostitute is wealth and luxury. But the commerce also involved the worship of these national gods. And so we see it's a pulling away from God to man's self-sufficiency and greed and pride. Now, then it says, "And the wine of whose prostitution the inhabitants of the earth have been intoxicated." Again, this seems to be a direct allusion to Jeremiah 51:7. Now, exactly this inhabitants of the earth is always used of unbelievers. When it says have been intoxicated, you might want to see chapter 14:8, where this theme is developed. Now in verse 3, "So he carried me away in a spiritual rapture." Now, this has been one of the keys to the structure of John. We've seen it back in chapter 1, verse 10. We saw it back in chapter 4, verse 2. And now we see it here in chapter 17. It shows how to break these visions up. Now, it says he was carried into a desert. There is an obvious antithesis between the woman in chapter 12 and the whore described here. The woman in chapter 12, verses 6 and 14, is taken to a desert. But why a desert here? Maybe to show the strong antithesis between the two, but maybe out in the desert you get a clear picture of what the whore looked like without being caught up in the system itself. Or maybe it's one of those direct allusions back to Isaiah 21:1, and some say it goes back to Babylon being a ruins or a desert, which is found in Isaiah 14:23 and again in 21:1. Which of these I'm not real sure, but something of that imagery is in the background. And I saw the woman seated on a scarlet wild beast. Now back in chapter 12:3, the dragon was also red, which is Satan. A different word, but same color. The wild beast, of course, is the two beasts, one that comes out of the sea, one that comes out of the land, described in chapter 13, which we believe is the Antichrist and his false prophet, or a mimic or a parody of Christ and the Holy Spirit. Now, and he was covered with blasphemous titles. This goes back to chapter 13:1 and chapter 13:5 and 6. Now, we think this refers to emperor worship of the first century, although it has a wider orientation in that. And some of the titles these emperors used for themselves would be divine, Savior, and Lord. And so we see they're claiming the titles of God, particularly Messiah, for themselves. Then it says he had 7 heads and 10 horns. This goes back to the description of the dragon in chapter 12:3, but particularly to the beast in chapter 13:1. And so we see it is obviously a satanic-inspired concept of great power. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet. Now, purple being royalty, scarlet being immorality. Some see that is the background. I personally see it just as great wealth and pomp. Decorated in gold and precious stones and pearls, and she had in her hand a cup of gold. This goes back directly to Jeremiah 51:7. Full of the abominations and the impurities of her immorality. Now we're going to find out that this basically is a cup full of the blood of the saints who she has been killing. She's been killing them because the saints stand against her greed and materialism. Now, notice it says, in verse 5, on her forehead was written a name. Now we learned from Rome, particularly 2 authors, Seneca and Juvenal, that the whores had a band across their head that had their name or the name of their owner on it. And so here, this is just fitting into a Roman prostitute kind of thing. And this forehead was also the place where the high priest had holy to the Lord. It's the place where the saints have been marked. And here it's the place where the mark of this prostitute is on her forehead, with a symbolical meaning. Now some say the word mystery here should go with the title, Mystery, Mighty Babylon, the mother of prostitutes. Now there's some disagreement among commentators if it's part of the title or simply a way of showing it's a figurative name. I think it's just a way of showing it's a figurative name because of the use of this term in other places in the book of the Revelation. Now, Mighty Babylon, the mother of prostitutes. I think it's important we see that this is a concept that started out in 14:8, was developed in 16, will be fully detailed in 17 and 18. Okay? Now, notice if you would, and let's see. When it says the mother of prostitutes, that implies to me there's not just one historical focus, but many. Although Rome is the obvious, immediate background, there are other backgrounds. I saw the woman drinking herself drunk. Present tense, she continued to be drunk with the blood of God's people and the blood of the martyrs, witnesses for Jesus. Continual persecution of the saints, but there are particular times when it gets very bad. Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the background to the book of Daniel. Titus is the background to Matthew 24. It is obvious here that the background is imperial Rome, emperor worship. In Daniel chapter 7, from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, from 1 John 2:18, it's obvious that an end-time persecution setting will be under the Antichrist. Now, notice it continues then when it says, Then I saw her, and I was utterly astonished. Now, King James has with great admiration, but the word has changed its meaning, and now it simply means he was wondered. He thought he was going to see the destruction of the whore, and what he first saw was her great prosperity and opulence. Now, and the angel said to me, Why are you astonished? I tell you that the symbolical meaning of the woman and the wild beast with the 7 heads and the 7 horns that carries her. Well, he's going to try to describe the woman. What he really describes is the wild beast. Now, notice what he says. Verse 8, the wild beast that you saw once was, but now is no more. He is going to come up out of the abyss, but he is going to be destroyed. Now, in just a minute, that theme is going to be developed in the sense of 10 kings. And this is one of the most controversial passages in all the book of the Revelation, but it is the central passage for those who believe that the book has a historical orientation, particularly to the Roman Empire, because I think this system fits Rome better than some other systems that I'll show you in just a minute. Now, some say the basis of this goes back to chapter 13, where the beast looked like it was slain, but it was alive. Some see that is the background of this. Others see this as the myth that Nero would come back to life and invade the Roman Empire. And still others see this as simply a way of speaking of a godless world system that is not always as dominant as other times in history. Now, and the mighty inhabitants of the earth, whose names from the foundation of the earth have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, will be astonished when they see that the wild beast once was, but now is no more and is yet to come. We're talking obviously about something that is going to be a powerful thing that's going to win the world back. That's why I think it may possibly be an allusion back to 13. Now, from the foundations of the earth, we covered that beautiful little phrase back in chapter 13:8, and I hope you'll look at your notes there. Also, the Lamb's book of life, the book of life, we covered that extensively in chapter 13, verse 8, and I hope you'll refer to your notes there. Now, when it says this deal about going to come and yet to come, he holds off for a minute on that, but in verse 9 he says, here is the scope for a mind that is packed with wisdom. Now, boy, men have always thought their minds were packed with wisdom, especially commentators. It's amazing to me as I read all the commentaries on Revelation how arrogant some of these men are that their position is the only position, when in reality our presuppositions often interpret these very ambiguous apocalyptic prophetic symbols of the book of the Revelation. And I want to show you that here. Notice it says, the 7 heads are the 7 heels. Now, it's going to say in a minute there's 7 kings, but right now there's 7 heels, and that is an obvious allusion to Rome in the ancient world. It was used quite often in ancient writers, on which the woman is seated. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is on the throne. The other has yet to come, and when he does, he must stay but a little while. So it is with the wild beast that he once was, but is no more. He is the 8th, and yet he is one of the 7, and he is going to be destroyed. Now, the obvious definition here is to go back to Roman emperors. Now, I must admit there's a little trickery here in where you start and who you leave out and all of that, and it's not as precise as we wish it would be. And the problem is, if you look at this right here, it makes John, if you put it in the context of Roman emperors, it makes John written during the reign of Vespasian, when most of the early writers assure us it was written under the reign of Domitian. So there is some problems with this, but this view seems to answer the most questions. The 5 emperors would be Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. You don't mention the 3 little impostors that grew up in year 69. The one who is at present would be Vespasian. Another one who is going to come but stay a little while would be Titus. And then finally the 8th that'd be out of the 7th would be Domitian, bringing in the Nero coming back to life myth, where Nero persecuted Christians some, and then Domitian much more. Now, I think that's the best answer, though it has some major problems. Another interesting interpretation here is that we're talking about empires, beginning with Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece, and then at present Rome. Although some say Old Babylon, Syria, Neo-Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greco-Macedonian. There's little difference on what empires you do, and I can certainly see that that is a very good interpretation. Now, a third interpretation by a man I like very much, Alan Johnson, says that all these numbers are symbolic. They weren't meant to be taken in history, as the numbers in Revelation mostly are, and he sees it as an allusion to Satan and the beast and their different manifestations. Now, fourth interpretation would see the whole thing is completely symbolic and referring to the current battle between good and evil that is manifested in every age. I think Rome is the best historical interpretation we have. I think the kingdoms fit quite well, but I think that there is no specific historical allusion here. I think it goes far beyond that. It's why we have so much trouble interpreting. But I want to tell you, this prophecy is extremely specific, and I'm very uncomfortable of taking it all symbolic. Now, notice then where it says in verse 12, "And the 10 horns that you saw are the 10 kings." Now, who are these? Well, the fact that they're called 10 kings who have not yet become kings seems to eliminate that as Roman empires. Others have said it's an obvious allusion back to Daniel 7, verses 23 and 24. And I must admit to you, Daniel 7 is the backdrop for most of this imagery, because in Daniel 7 is the little horn that really is the end-time Antichrist, while in Daniel chapter 8 is the little horn, which is Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the Seleucid ruler during the Maccabean period. Now, others say this is vassals of Rome, some other kingdoms like Herod around that Rome controlled but did not dominate. Now, some say it's the demonic horde of chapter 9. Others say, no, it's the end-time world leaders, but the number of 10 is symbolic, not literal. And so you can see the vast majority. I think, again, it's vassal kings with Rome fits best. Now it says, for a single hour. This is a very popular concept in John. We found it in chapter 18, 10, 17, and 19, and so often in the Gospel of John about the destiny. And throughout this book, these persecuted Christians were encouraged by the fact that God is in control of history. They accept the authority as kings allied with the wild beast. They have one common policy, and they will give their power and authority to the wild beast. And they will make war upon the Lamb. It's not the first time they've done that. Back in chapter 11, verse 7, back in 13:7, they do the same thing. But the Lamb will conquer them. And notice the saints are going to participate in Jesus' victory. He calls us the chosen, the elect, the faithful. Now the word the chosen, the elect, emphasize God's initiating love and predestinating care. But the ideal of faithful also emphasizes man's repentant faith response to God's free offer in Christ. Notice it says the followers will conquer with him. Because he is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Now, this same phrase repeated in 1916, the vision of the second coming when Jesus returns. This is the title that he will bear. There seems to be a historical allusion here. This is a Babylonian title used of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2:37 and of Yahweh in Deuteronomy 10:17. Now in 15 through 18 is a very specific prophecy that some have said is an addition to the text. But all the manuscripts we have include it. The waters here are reinterpreted as being peoples. And the wild beast has 10 horns, and these 10 horns are going to attack the prostitute. Now, if you know Roman history, it seems that Roman power fell simply because of her power. She was invaded by some of her vassal kings, finally, and this seems to fit history the best. So it seems to be an emphasis on internal strife, or evil divided among itself, which seems to be the allusion back in Revelation 16:12. So evil seems to be divided. The particular Old Testament imagery for this verse 16 is found in Ezekiel 16:39 and 40, Ezekiel 23:25 through 27, and Ezekiel 28:18. Now verse 17. For God has put it into their hearts. Notice God is control of history. As God uses the demonic frogs back in chapter 16, verses 13 and 14, he's going to use these 10 kings to bring judgment on this great whore also. Now, it seems in chapter 17 that God brings judgment through these, and then in chapter 18 it seems that God brings judgment himself. I think they're complementary and not two different things at all. It's obvious to me that 17 and 18 form a unity and talk about the very same thing from two different angles. Now, then it says, let's see, verse 18, and the woman whom you saw is the great city. That great city goes back to its use in chapter 11, verse 8, where it seems to be Jerusalem, but is far more than that. In chapter 16:19, where it obviously is Rome. It's going to be used several times in chapter 18 also, that great city that has domination over the kings of the earth. That implies political rule current in John's day, so I think there's no way we could say this is not imperial Rome. Now, chapter 18 is obviously the commercial aspects of Rome, and maybe where she got her ideal of her pride. We see this commercial aspects in verses 3, 9, 11 through 19, and 23. Again, the background is the Old Testament fall of some of these great commercial cities who thought they were impregnable because of their wealth and luxury, and yet they fell. A perfect example is the king of Tyre, Ezekiel 28, but also the fall of Babylon, which is found in Isaiah 14, 21, and Jeremiah 50 and 51 is the obvious background. But particularly in this one, it's going to be Ezekiel 26 and 27 and Isaiah 23. Now, after this I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority. A strong term used for an angel only here. And the earth was lighted up with his splendor. It's a very powerful metaphor for an angel, but we've seen some really powerful angels in this book. And he shouted with a mighty voice, "She has fallen, mighty Babylon, she has fallen." Now, this has been said several times. Chapter 11, verse 8, chapter 14, 8, chapter 16, 19, and 20, and all of 17 dealt with her fall. We're looking at the same event from a little different perspective. It seems to be an obvious allusion here to Jeremiah 51, verse 8. "She has become a den for demons and a haunt for every foul spirit and every unclean, loathsome bird." This is Old Testament imagery for the fall of some of these ancient cities and how they were desolated. We found that these birds and animals that inhabit desolate places were used as a name for demons in some recent archaeological exploration. Now, here are some Old Testament backgrounds, very specific here. Isaiah 13, 21 and 22 of Babylon, Isaiah 34, 10 through 15 of Edom, Jeremiah 51, 37, and Jeremiah 50, 39 for Babylon, and Zephaniah 2:14 for Nineveh, desolate and inhabitants of demons. Now, notice it says, "Because all the nations have fallen by drinking the raging wine of her immorality." It's perfect tense here. It speaks that they corrupted the whole world with their wealth and pride and opulence. That's the idea. And the background, of course, is the worship of those national gods. They joined in her immorality, which is seen to be beast worship, and the businessmen of the earth. Now, we're going to develop that theme throughout. Have grown rich from the wealth of her luxury, and that seems to be the basic lure of this society. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people." This is a direct allusion to Jeremiah 51, 6, 9, and 45 that dealt with them returning from Babylon, and it's just an allusion to that. Now it says, "My people," it seems to be God or Christ speaking here, "so that you may not share in her sins and suffer her plagues." Now, for her sins have piled up to heaven. Another direct allusion to Jeremiah 51, 9. It's glued up to heaven. "And God has remembered," which in the Bible always means God's judgment. CF 16, 19. "The wrong she has done. Pay her back in her own coin." This is the biblical truth that we reap what we sow. You might want to see Jeremiah 50, 15 and 29. You might want to see Matthew 7, 2. Galatians 6, 7, Revelation 13, 10, we reap what we sow. Pay her back with what she has paid others. Give her double. Now this is an allusion to Jeremiah 16, 18 and 17, 18. We see the same truth in Isaiah 40, verse 2, and Exodus 22, verses 4 through 9. She gets paid back double. Full justice is what she's going to have. Now notice in verse 7 where it says, "To the same degree to which she lived in splendor and luxury, give her torture and tears." That's the same thing. "Because she is always boasting in her heart." You might want to see Zephaniah 2:15 about pride. Pride seems to be the fall of the evil one. It seems to be the fall of Tyre, Ezekiel 28, and Babylon, Isaiah 14, which is the background of Satan falling. She said, "I sit enthroned as a queen." This seems to go back to Isaiah 47, 7. And then in verse 8 seems to be an allusion to Isaiah 47, 9, where it says, "This will overtake her in a single day." Now, down in verses 17 and 19 of this chapter, it says her doom will come in a single hour, meaning it will be very quick judgment and very severe. Now, notice that these plagues, these Old Testament plagues we've seen so often, back from Leviticus 26, are going to fall on her. Because the Lord who has judged her is mighty. That's a direct allusion again to Jeremiah 50, verse 34. Now there's three groups of people here who are going to mourn her. The kings of the earth are mentioned here in verse 9, the businessmen of the earth in verse 11 and following, and the sea captains and seamen down in verse 17. They're going to mourn because their economic trade and wealth has been destroyed. This is a very specific list of some of the international trade that Rome was involved in, where we see the whole world was involved in this. Of course, these sea merchants is reminiscent of the city of Tyre, because they were also a wealthy sea power found in Ezekiel 26 and 27, which is the obvious background to this section. In your notes, I've listed all these spices and things and given you a definition and a geographical location of their origin. Now, notice, if you will, where down in verse 18, and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, what city was like the great city? As a direct allusion to Ezekiel 27:32, and they threw dust on their heads and wept and mourned. That's from Ezekiel 27:30, and so you can see the allusion. Now, notice it says, celebrate over her. That is an allusion back to Jeremiah 51:48, and you see how we're pulling on these Old Testament passages for the destruction of these proud cities over and over again. Now, some say this celebrate over her goes back to Deuteronomy 32:43, but I think the Jeremiah passage is better. And now in verses 21 and following, the angels are going to hurl her into the sea. It's an obvious allusion to Jeremiah 51, 63, and 64. It refers to Tyre also in Ezekiel 26:27. We have these musicians, and that's an Old Testament background. She's going to be totally destroyed. She's never going to rise again. In just these few verses, 21 through 23, are 6 double negatives, the strongest way in Greek to say it's never going to happen again. And notice down here in the very last it says why. The reasons for her fall. For your businessmen were great men of the earth. That's number one, the pride there, economic pride. Number two, by your magic all the nations have been led astray. The word magic is the word pharmacy or pharmakia. It's the idea we see back in 9:21. And number three, in her have been found the blood of prophets, saints, and all who have been slaughtered on the earth. She's responsible for killing the people of God, for pride, and for alluring all the other nations with the magic of her, not only her idolatry, but also of her wealth and pride. And so here we have a picture of Babylon, the great city, the city of rebellious man organized apart from God. It's true of Babylon, it's true of Nineveh, it's true of Jerusalem, it's true of Rome, it's true of New York, it's true of Hong Kong, it's true of Moscow, it's true of man. There's going to be an ultimate end-time system, but God's going to destroy it too. What courage that took for the saints in that day to hang in there. I've enjoyed being with you. I'll see you again next week.